lawsuit is the deepest look we've gotten of just how bad things could be at the Southern Regional Jail and beyond. On Monday, attorneys representing current and former SRJ inmates are going before a federal magistrate to argue that the state has been destroying evidence in their investigation. Now we're getting a first-hand look at the scope of the problems inside the facility that saw 13 inmates die just last year. At the Southern Regional Jail in Raleigh County are documented instances of no water in cells,
Cell 1, sink doesn't work.
to toilets that won't flush,
Cell 16, toilet doesn't flush.
mold-infested areas, unsanitary conditions, and allegations of basic human needs like medical care and food being withheld from inmates.
It was just a powder keg at the Southern Regional Jail for the longest time.
Beckley attorney Stephen New is representing current and former inmates at the Southern Regional Jail in a class action lawsuit focusing on conditions inside the facility.
This isn't being soft on crime. The 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution and the West Virginia Constitution talk about cruel and unusual punishment, and there's lots of case law about where the line gets crossed from this is jail and it was not designed to be a comfortable situation to the point where it does get unconstitutional. I believe we crossed that line in West Virginia a long time ago.
New is also filing a federal injunction against Governor Jim Justice and others. He wants to force the state to do $270 million in deferred maintenance and spend at least $60 million to fill vacancies. Corrections officials echoing the same sentiment in recent deposition videos obtained by Eyewitness News that the governor and legislature have repeatedly been told about the dire conditions and needs that have gone unmet and unfunded for years.
Prior to every legislative session, we have meetings with the budget office. We provide them with our needs. Our needs were clearly articulated along with all other Homeland Security agencies. They're advised of that. We transparent, we tell them.
Did you ask the question, how did we get here? How did we get to $200 million of deferred maintenance?
I'm sure that everybody asks that question, and the answer was we depend on the money that's allotted to us. Every year there's a certain amount that is allotted for maintenance. But it doesn't touch what the overarching bill is.
Former Corrections Commissioner Betsy Jividen said she was pressured to resign in July 2022 over the death of a family member of one of the governor's cabinet secretaries.
Who gave you word that the governor wanted you gone?
Jeff Sandy.
And why did the governor want you gone?
I can tell you what Jeff Sandy told me.
Okay, do that.
Jeff Sandy told me that Brian Abraham was upset about Secretary Wriston's nephew dying in the hospital after being incarcerated at Southern, and that he had gone to the governor, and that's when the governor had asked for my resignation.
Who is Secretary Wriston?
Secretary of Transportation.
In his testimony, Sandy denied it happened, and Jividen said she'd been debating stepping down before that incident out of sheer frustration.
Not being able to get the pay raises, not being able to do the maintenance, it was very frustrating.
The deposition's also painting a questionable picture of an investigation ordered by Justice into the Southern Regional Jail in March 2022. Sandy, who was State Homeland Security Cabinet Secretary at the time, said he was ordered to go to the facility by Justice Chief of Staff Brian Abraham.
Why did the governor order this investigation?
Because of all the negative media that was out there concerning Southern Regional Jail.
Allegations in the press that inmates were drinking out of toilets, not being given toilet paper, and sleeping on bare floors.
Those were the main things that they were interested in, was water, toilet paper, and mattresses.
Less than a month before Sandy's visit, 37-year-old Quantez Burks died in custody after being at the Southern Regional Jail for less than 48 hours. The state said he died of natural causes, but a private autopsy proved otherwise.
He walked in and got carried out in a body bag, and What's wrong?
It's not right.
2 corrections officers are set to plead guilty in November after federal investigators say Burks was beaten as punishment while restrained.
I was very upset by that. I reviewed the videos myself. I read the reports. I worked on the report. I spent a lot of time going over that. I recommended that an expert be hired to look at that use of force. Several people lost their jobs.
None of that was part of the investigation Sandy was ordered to conduct. Nothing about staffing, overcrowding, a growing number of inmate deaths, or anything other than water, toilet paper, and mattresses. Sandy said he only personally talked to 3 inmates who were handpicked by jail leaders and several COs. 10 more inmates were interviewed by another investigator a week later. He said he didn't step foot inside a cell, didn't check sinks, showers, or toilets.
Did not go into any pod, did not go into any cell. I went to the observation area and looked down on multiple pods.
Test the water from there?
Did not test the water from there, sir.
Sandy said he hadn't been told about a walkthrough and documentation of the shape of the jail just a few months prior when these videos and pictures were taken by a lieutenant.
No means of working communication from cell to tower. So after lockdown, they'd have to beat on the doors.
But later he testified he wished he had. About a month later, the governor's office published Sandy's 14-page report, concluding nothing was wrong at the jail. They called the allegations made in the news simply not true.
It is correct, sir. I stand by the report.
While the lawsuit cites inaction by the Justice Administration, the governor declared a state of emergency over staffing at West Virginia jails more than a year ago and called in the National Guard to help.
We have been dealing with this situation for too long. Way too long.
A month ago, Justice signed several bills meant to prop up the decaying facilities that have a roughly 30% overall vacancy rate. His new Department of Homeland Security Cabinet Secretary and Corrections Commissioner stood beside him.
Now we're on a pathway of making things better for a lot of folks that are here. But not only that, we're on a pathway to hopefully be able to have adequate staffing to where everybody can do their job safely and do their job correctly and do their job humanely in every way.
New thinks the new legislation is simply too little, too late.
Within the Justice Administration, they have the ability to fix a lot of these issues.
We've reached out to Governor Justice's top administration for comment, and Chief of Staff Brian Abraham has agreed to sit down with me early next week. As for the separate federal investigation into the facility that led to the charges against the 2 correctional officers for the death of Quantez Burks, it's still ongoing. Reporting in the studio, Leslie Rubin, Eyewitness News.
Tonight, Eyewitness News reporter Leslie Rubin was there for that hearing that drew strong words from the judge toward the state.
Today's hearing was focused solely on evidence in the ongoing federal class action suit centered around conditions at the Southern Regional Jail that attorneys claim were inhumane and unconstitutional. Attorney Steve New, who's leading the class action suit on behalf of current and former inmates, argues that the state has destroyed evidence, things like emails, video, inmate grievances, and cell phones that were ordered to be preserved under law. And it was clear from Magistrate Omar Abu-Hussen's reactions and comments throughout the hearing that he found testimony from current and former high-ranking State Department of Homeland Security and Divisions of Corrections and Rehabilitation employees that it simply wasn't a thought to preserve that evidence. Hard to believe. A direct quote from him: "My head is about to explode up here trying to understand how in the world this happened." We heard from current DCR Executive Director Brad Douglas about he said he simply did not have an excuse and he just didn't think to preserve emails from former officials like DCR Commissioner Betsy Jividen and former SRJ Superintendent Mike Francis after they left the state. There was lengthy testimony during today's 4.5-hour marathon hearing about how everyone just thought the emails would be preserved and no one seemed to know that they'd be completely gone after 30 days, or what the state calls deprovisioned. There was testimony like, quote, "I should have known that, but didn't didn't think about it. They said that some state cell phones couldn't be accessed because they just didn't know the codes to get into them, or they couldn't find the phones. When it came to video, an attorney for DHS blamed the plaintiff's attorneys for not supplying hard drives to copy it themselves. The judge calling the testimony damning, even though an attorney for former top jail and prison officials explained the issues away by testimony that there was never any intent within the state to destroy the evidence and make it irretrievable. They contend that this is all just technical, they didn't think of it. The judge found that hard to believe. Do you think that there was an intent to not have these emails available and this video available?
Here's what I will say about that, is it seems awfully convenient knowing the wave of case after case after case that was going to be brought against the Southern Regional Jail, that no one just happened to think we need to preserve evidence.
She's here now to break down new numbers on how much the state of emergency is costing you and how the governor justifies the use of the money. Leslie?
It was Chief of Staff Brian Abraham's chance to respond to our reporting over the last several weeks about a number of ongoing issues at the state's correctional facilities. And it's a contentious topic that's likely to get a lot of attention as next year's legislative session is just around the corner. It's been more than a year since Governor Jim Justice declared a state of emergency over critical staffing shortages at correctional facilities across West Virginia. Since then, more than 300 National Guard members have been helping staff the facilities that house more than 10,000 inmates. The Guard doesn't perform correctional officer duties, but they do come with a hefty price tag. According to the most recent numbers from the state auditor's office, $21,705,002.91 has been paid from the Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation to the Guard for salaries since the state of emergency. Just shy of $3 million on top of that has been spent on hotels for Guard members to stay near the facilities they're assigned. How does the governor justify the use of that taxpayer money?
Part of that money, if it weren't spent on the National Guard members, a good portion of it would be going to wages for correctional officers if they were in those positions. But it's not fair to say if the Guard weren't there, there would be correctional officers there and you wouldn't incur these additional costs. Because the simple fact of the matter is we can't fill those positions. That's why the Guard's there in the first place, right? So, and it's not simplistic enough to say give more money and we'll give raises to everybody and all of a sudden we'll start filling these positions. We've tried that before and it didn't work.
As of September 28th, there are a combined total of 1,007 vacancies at the state's prisons, jails, and juvenile centers, or 27% overall. 479 of those empty positions are within the 11 prisons, 348 within the 10 regional jails.
The last couple of years, the governor has tried to think outside the box, and we proposed legislation that would offer incentive pay to different geographic areas where we saw need. We have right. We have in the Eastern Panhandle, we have 70% vacancy. At Charleston, we don't. So we were trying to address the specific issues. The legislature didn't go along with that in those years. So again, this year, and under Betsy Jividen, they walked in and said, let's just give everybody a $10,000 raise. And we, working with the legislature, said, wait a second, they're not going to accept that, but let's look and see where we actually have vacancies. So as we looked at our senior ranks, people that were making a pretty good wage and had many years of experience, we didn't have any vacancies. So to throw $10,000 at that person was really wasteful when we saw our vacancies was in the people in the first couple of years of being employed. So we wanted to strategically cause the raises to happen more there.
Abraham and I also talked about the ongoing federal class action lawsuits surrounding allegations of inhumane and unconstitutional conditions at the Southern Regional Jail. Before the suit was filed last year, Abraham ordered then Department of Homeland Security Cabinet Secretary Jeff Sandi to go to the jail following media reports that inmates were sleeping on the floor, drinking out of toilets, and not being given things like toilet paper. Sandi's report concluded nothing was wrong at the jail, even though in recent deposition testimony obtained by Eyewitness News, Sandi admitted he never actually stepped foot inside a cell.
Immediately upon seeing some of the news stories come out of the Beckley area, the governor looked at me and said, there's smoke, there could be fire, look into this. So I asked Secretary Sandi, and I think that very day he took it upon himself to drive to the Beckley jails. I think there's been a couple of follow-up investigations since then. the information provided back to the governor's office has been consistent with that first investigation.
Why, though, at the time was the investigation ordered to just be around the food, the water, and the mattresses?
Those were the original complaints that were coming in. We were seeing in the media at that time there hadn't been any lawsuits filed, and so we had to put out the fires that were popping up. So I asked him to address those specific information.
Even though just a couple weeks earlier, Quantez Burks had died and there'd been a growing number of inmate deaths, that's not something that you wanted him to look into?
No, that was an isolated incident regarding Quantez Burks. That was what became a criminal case, which was being investigated criminally. We were involved in assisting with that, both at a state police level and then eventually a federal level. The other deaths are they run the gamut of cardiac arrest in elderly people, et cetera. So we've always been informed by the Department of Corrections that things were being managed properly, that there were issues that would occur infrequently. For instance, if correctional officers assaulted an inmate, that's something we don't condone. It's not tolerated. The governor demands their immediate removal from those jobs. So those things happen, and when they do, we take action. But to put a blanket out and say everything's bad there, investigate the entire place, there wasn't anything we were seeing that would have called that to our attention enough to demand that at that time.
A few months after the Sandy report was issued, DCR Commissioner Betsy Jividen resigned. In her deposition, she alleged it was because Sandy told her Abraham demanded she step down following the death of Transportation Secretary Jimmy Riston's nephew after he was incarcerated at Southern.
Absolutely false. Categorically denied. For a long period of time, I would say I had questions of confidence in Betsy Jividen's ability to be a leader at the Department of Corrections. Some of these issues kept popping up. There didn't seem to be a vision how to address them immediately and respond in the public and let them have confidence in the correctional facility. And for a long period of time, a number of months, Jeff Sandy had advised me she was disheartened there, felt like that things weren't going well and wanted to retire. So it was not directly related to the Jimmy Riston relative matter, but I remember asking Jeff Sandy, when is she going to retire? And at some point, she came back and said, okay, now's the time to retire.
Abraham also takes issue with a $330 million lawsuit recently filed in federal court seeking to have a judge force the state to spend $60 million to fill vacancies and perform $270 million in deferred maintenance at the aging facilities.
That's just a number that's plucked out of, if you could fix everything to include the light switch on the wall that may have a crack in it, here's what corrections has said they would want.
It was filed the same day lawmakers, during a special session, approved raises and bonuses for corrections employees and several other bills meant to bolster the facilities.
Unrelated to that lawsuit at all, the legislature appropriated almost $80 million for deferred maintenance. We've just signed a bonding agreement with a company that for HVAC that's probably going to put another $50+ million of work in our jails. And of course, we passed the $35 million pay raise. All that completely unrelated to the lawsuit. Seemed like it was watching what we were doing in the news and then filed it there at the very tail end as we were getting across the finish line. These things we do, we plan years in advance as far as budgeting goes. So it's not like we're reactionary. These were strategic things we were doing to move into corrections and try to make some improvement. Will we get everything? No. But for a single court or a judge or anybody to place themselves in place of the legislature and the executive that actually knows the detail of what's going on, or a lawyer, a plaintiff's lawyer, to think that they know better than everybody else what we should spend is actually just ridiculous.
At a hearing last week in the SRJ lawsuit, federal magistrate Omar Abu Hussein said he couldn't wrap his head around hours of testimony from current and former corrections officials centered around how evidence in the case had been handled. Abraham contends no one intentionally destroyed evidence.
Was there a mistake made? Yes, by somebody at Department of Corrections, whether it was a legal person or not, should have put Department of Technology on notice that there was a pending litigation, not to delete those emails. Was there any kind of effort to destroy information? That's absolutely false. It's a shame they even filed it that way, to be quite honest with you.
I also had the chance to sit down one-on-one with newly appointed DHS Cabinet Secretary Mark Sorcea to talk about all of these issues and what has to happen to end the state of emergency. Coming up next in my series of reports, you'll hear from Sorcea directly about a surprise trip he made to the Southern Regional Jail, and we have new numbers about overcrowding in the facilities that may surprise you.
Tonight, Leslie Rubin sits down one-on-one with newly appointed State Department of Homeland Security Cabinet Secretary Mark Sorcea.
Within his first week on the job as Cabinet Secretary for the West Virginia Department of Homeland Security, Mark Sorcea had already been named in a lawsuit focused on conditions in the state's regional jails and prisons.
I'm frustrated about the litigation.
The suit is seeking to force the state to do $270 million in deferred maintenance at the facilities and spend $60 million to fill vacancies across the system that has more than 1,000 empty positions.
I don't think it's in the taxpayers' interest to just throw $300 million at a perceived problem that may not exist. I think the way we're doing it is the appropriate way of doing it for the taxpayers and for the people at the prison, because the jail that I went to, they was looking pretty good.
The jail he's talking about visiting is the Southern Regional Jail in Raleigh County, a facility that's now the focus of a federal class action lawsuit alleging inhumane and unconstitutional conditions. Sorcea says he made a surprise visit there in early September.
And I can tell you, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that jail. Quite frankly, I was shocked about how nice and good condition that jail was in. The plumbing worked, it was clean, there's no overcrowding. I saw the food, I talked to the inmates. I had explanations, they had running water. There was allegations that it was overcrowded and people were sleeping in the pods. I asked the fellow running the jail what the head count was. They were 3 or 4 below capacity, so they were within capacity. I went to the medical unit about the medical care, and I'm just bewildered that on one hand we have these allegations, and then on the other hand, I saw what I saw. I made a comment, if I was a federal judge and I walked through that prison, that case would be gone in 10 minutes.
We tried to check his claim that there was no overcrowding at Southern that day, but multiple requests for the inmate population during the time frame were unanswered by the state. We also asked if he thought conditions had improved in light of the litigation and increased scrutiny of the facility that saw more than a dozen deaths last year, including one inmate who was beaten by correctional officers while restrained and later died.
I believe West Virginia, our prison system, is more than acceptable at the present time based on national standards, and I'll go as far as saying so far that we have a good system. What we have done is overall, if you look at all the regional jails overall, basically the amount of beds we have is almost always sufficient to handle the total amount of inmates we have overall. And what could happen at Beckley is we may have a surge and we may end up getting 4 or 5 or 6 inmates that put us over capacity. Well, Corrections has a new policy now. What they do, they move them. So if we have too many at Southern Regional Jail, they may put 5 or 6 in a van and move them to Western Regional Jail. So what we do is when we have overcapacity at one facility, we have a new system where we can move them and and keep in the capacity levels of our institutions. So I think that system's working well.
According to new numbers obtained by Eyewitness News through a Freedom of Information Act request, Southern still leads the other 9 regional jails in the number of inmate deaths this year, with 4 so far. 6 other facilities have 2 or fewer. Sorcea says he's focused on hiring correctional officers, letting them know they're supported, and seeing an end to the state of emergency that's placed National Guard troops in the facilities for more than a year.
When the governor says we may still have work to do, I think my interpretation of that is, well, we took, we're taking baby steps. We took our first step, and we're going to see how that works out.
But it's not case closed for the governor, as the judge has yet to rule officially if those lawyers will get a chance to question the state's chief executive. Governor Jim Justice says he has no problem giving testimony in a lawsuit about conditions at the Southern Regional Jail, but he thinks it would be a lost cause.
I would welcome anyone at any time to swear me into doing sworn testimony, but we just don't want to just do something that is an absolute teetotal waste of time over something that I don't know anything about.
Plaintiff's attorney Steve New wants to depose Justice and his Chief of Staff Brian Abraham about the executive branch's priorities for the jails. Neither are named as defendants in the suit that was filed in September of last year. Other deposition testimony from former corrections officials suggests the governor's office was aware of the needs of the facilities. That includes hundreds of millions of dollars in deferred maintenance.
There's no point in going in and sitting there and letting someone grandstand so they can get their name in the newspaper, some lawyer, so they can get their name in the paper and everything.
U.S. Magistrate Judge Omar Abul Hussein will be the one to decide. He stopped the depositions that were set to take place on Tuesday from happening until he reviews arguments from both sides. An attorney for Justice and Abraham said in court filings that questioning the two on funding decisions are irrelevant to the issues in the lawsuit, and said the plaintiffs haven't demonstrated the extraordinary circumstances needed to justify the depositions.
To basically haul the governor in there, to have the governor say, I don't know anything about this, and I can't help you with anything. I can say that right now. And if that be the case, and that's what we need to do, that'll make people feel better and be happier and everything, I'll be glad to do it.
New has indicated he wants to ask questions about the administration's decision to transfer $28.3 million unspent federal COVID relief dollars to a fund controlled by the governor. Of that amount, $10 million eventually went toward funding Marshall University's new baseball stadium. Abraham says the money went to more projects than Marshall and wouldn't have solved any problems at the jail.
The fact of the matter is that money that came back in through COVID and was redirected to the gifts and grants, it went to not only Marshall but other economic development projects. The money would not have done anything regarding the salary items at the regional jails or at the prisons, because that was one-time money. It would have done nothing for the budget, and tens of millions have already been allocated for deferred maintenance to our regional jails.
Messy and chaotic week for jail officials, also caught in the middle of that document debacle you've been reporting on for months now.
Yeah, Anthony, certainly this plea hearing could not have come at a worse time for the West Virginia Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation. It's been an embarrassing week for them after the federal magistrate in a civil case in the same issue at the Southern Regional Jail issued that blistering order earlier this week over conditions in the same jail that Quantes Burks lost his life in. And that's what's brought us here today. Andrew Fleshman and Stephen Wimmer just pleaded guilty on a conspiracy charge for Burks' death that happened at the Southern Regional Jail on March 1st of last year. The 37-year-old was a pretrial detainee at the facility who died less than a day after being booked there on a wanton endangerment charge. Court documents say Burks tried to push past an officer in order to leave his housing unit. He was then allegedly escorted into an interview room where he was allegedly assaulted while handcuffed and posed no threat. Prosecutors say Burks was then taken to another cell where he was assaulted again. The state's autopsy said he died of natural causes, but his family had a second private autopsy conducted that found multiple areas of blunt force trauma on his body. Now, just days following Burks' death, Governor Jim Justice ordered then Homeland Security Cabinet Secretary Jeff Sandie to conduct an investigation at the jail after inmates were raising concerns over not having water and other basic needs like mattresses. Now, that investigation, which has since been called into question for a number of reasons, found no evidence of inhumane treatment. However, there was a class action lawsuit that was filed in the case in September of last year. Now, on Monday, federal magistrate Omar Abul-Hassan blasted corrections officials in the case. Abul-Hassan said evidence in the lawsuit was intentionally destroyed by the state, including email, cell phones, and inmate grievances. The magistrate called what happened on the state's watch a, quote, dereliction of duty, and even asked that a copy of the order be given to federal prosecutors to consider whether an investigation of the DCR should happen. Governor Justice remains adamant nothing was intentionally destroyed, even saying yesterday that if anyone was involved in that, they need fired and prosecuted. And in another bombshell, we've since learned that Executive Officer of DCR Brad Douglas, who even served as interim commissioner not too long ago, he's been fired. Douglas had admitted on the stand that no one thought to preserve the evidence despite numerous litigation
investigation hold notices. We can also tell you that General Counsel for DHS, Phil Sword, he's also been fired. He's also now no longer working at the Attorney General's office. Al-Hassan called Sword's testimony, quote, infuriating, as Sword placed blame on the plaintiffs for evidence being lost.
When people are directed, that to not destroy something or whatever it may be, or to supply something,